Last week at President Biden's climate summit, he committed the United States to reducing greenhouse gas emissions 50% by over 2005 levels by 2030. It's very ambitious, and it will be achieved in large part by electrifying parts of transportation, buildings, and industry. Well, where's all that power going to come from? And more importantly, how it is going to be handled by the power grid? These kind of technical issues need more conversation. And so we're going to talk to Jenny Erwin, who is Director of Strategic Marketing for Smart Wires, a member of the Watt Coalition. So welcome to the interview, Jenny.
Thanks for having me.
Well, look, what's your take on this? Your company and the Watt Coalition are promoting grid enhancing technologies, and you basically argue that the technology exists to significantly increase the amount of renewables in the existing grid.
Exactly. So we're really excited to see President Biden's announcement last week. I think it's really putting the U.S. on the global stage and putting us in a leadership role. The question really is how we get there, right? And what you're saying in terms of electrifying industries that traditionally haven't been run on electricity has huge implications for how much electricity we need to be generating year over year and transmitting at high volumes. And so, to think that we could just double the transmission capacity of the US, if we're doubling the demand, right, for electrifying all these other sectors, simply doubling the transmission capacity, it's a huge undertaking, right? From a timelines perspective, how long it takes these projects to get permitted and built, from an investment perspective and what that means for consumer bills. And so at the Watt Coalition, what we'd like to contribute to the conversation is the opportunity that exists to get way more out of today's grid and out of any future expansion. So, we recently released a study with the Brattle Report that looked at how many more renewables we could integrate by just using the existing infrastructure more effectively. And we could double the amount of renewables integrated with just a really small investment. We're talking, less than 10% of annual transmission investment. So when you look at those numbers, it really makes you scratch your head and ask, do we need to double the investment? We don't. We can just be more efficient.
Yeah, I think that's something that's not well appreciated by the general public. I mean, who talks about power grid technologies, right? You just assume that the utilities and the people who are running the power grids are doing it as efficiently as possible. But we know that other countries like Europe, for instance, have employed these technologies and they work really well. Why hasn't the US done this in the past?
So I think it comes back to the incentives, right? Utilities operate based on their financial and economic incentives. And what we've seen, so we work with utilities all across the world under different regulatory regimes and different incentive structures. And when those structures are based on outputs and based on driving savings for consumers or making sure that the investments are explicitly efficient, then we see utilities adopting these grid enhancing technologies at a much quicker pace and at a much larger scale. In the US, most of the incentives are based on a regulated rate of return. So utilities earn money based on how much they invest. And that doesn't naturally drive the same emphasis on efficiency that we've seen elsewhere. But that's changing. So it's really good to see.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute because I think it's changing all over North America, including in some parts of Canada. So what are the technologies? I know I've interviewed one of your colleagues and there were 3 grid enhancing technologies. Is that only the 3 or are there more than that?
So right now, we really see 3 key technologies. That's not to say others might not be developed in the future. We encourage a very broad definition of grid enhancing technology. So it's hardware or software that basically increases the utilization of today's grid, increases the efficiency of existing infrastructure. Today, that really comes down to 3 options. The first is dynamic line rating. The second is advanced power flow control. And the third is topology optimization.
Right, and these are known technologies. This isn't something that just came off of the out of the lab and hasn't been tested or piloted, in a real world situation.
Exactly. All these technologies have been around for more than a decade, and they're fully deployed in many places all around the world. Yep, fully commercial.
Well, so let's talk about the changes that are taking place that facilitate this, because I think what you're getting at here is that the distributed energy resources, wind and solar and batteries and so on, that are really causing a revolution in utility business models across the United States and in some parts of Canada. And if it hasn't yet, it soon will, because everybody is going to have to grapple with these new technologies at some point. And once you move to a flatter structure, more like your grid looks more like a web, and you integrate markets like wholesale markets and so on more efficiently, then it seems to me that you then are able to provide the incentives in your regulatory structure to adopt the technologies you're talking about. Have I got it right?
Sure, you covered there. There's a lot there. I think the market structure has a lot to do with it. Some of it comes down to, maybe blurring the line. So historically, CapEx and OpEx have been thought of as very separate, expenditures from the utility standpoint. But when you begin to blur the lines of those, a lot of these new technologies, a lot of the advancement that we're seeing in the tools that utilities can use sometimes wind up being on the operational side of things. So you really do need to think about, the way that these investments are structured to make sure that utilities aren't having to choose between doing what's right for shareholders and doing what's right for customers, right? The job of the regulatory regime is to make sure that those things are naturally aligned.
Yeah, and one final point before we wrap up the interview, Jenny, and that is that I hear this all the time, especially from sort of skeptics of the energy transition and of the changes taking place. And that is, if this technology made sense, if these changes made sense, then the market would have done it a long time ago, or the market, why do we have to subsidize it? And I don't think people understand the importance of policy and policy and the regulatory regime to incenting innovation and adopting new technologies. It's not just a case of it's economic or not economic in the market. How you design policy and regulations is really key to innovation.
I couldn't agree more. I think, when you look at the historic context of grid development, a lot of the structures that we still have in place today in the US were developed when we were at a stage as a industry and as a country of really building out the grid and encouraging companies to make massive investments to build out the grid. We need to do that still today, but technology has advanced, and looking at where you can make sure that the incentives are aligned. So, for instance, with what we've been focused on for the past 2 years is really to bring learnings that we've seen elsewhere around the world back to the US and figure out what works in the US context. One of those has been this idea of shared savings, which we borrowed from the UK, to make sure that utilities get to recoup some of the savings that they generate from investing in these efficient investments, and share that between consumers and shareholders, so that you're not having to choose one over the other. It's really interesting to look at what's happening in Canada as well. I know NRCan just recently launched the Smart Renewables and Electrification Pathways program, which has a huge carve out for grid modernization. And what they explicitly call out is focusing on projects based on outcomes like improved asset utilization. And so we're beginning to see this, and I think there's an opportunity for us to take learnings from that and reframe it perhaps as a DOE program. There's so many opportunities for us to learn from other regimes all over the world and to really drive value for consumers at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is I'm fond of saying that in an energy transition, the third decade is always the disruptive one. And really that now is the 2020s. And then we're seeing that in the electricity industry in so many areas where it's being disrupted by new technologies, and everybody's trying to, they're doing a tap dance to catch up to technology change in many ways. Jenny, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark. Have a great day.